Welcome to Real Grief, Real Healing with Mindy Corporan. I am your host, Mindy. A friend of mine told me in early 2018 that she saw a vision of me with a microphone in front of me. I laughed at the time and said, "I don't see any microphones in my future." Less than a year later, I was recording my first podcast on this show. I'm not going to say, "I hope you enjoy this podcast." My podcast is not truly meant to be enjoyed. Real grief, real healing is just that, real and raw. I provide you an opportunity to learn and share in the grief others are experiencing, and then we share how they are healing or perhaps not. Grief changes each of us in some way. Many of my guests have been encouraged to open new businesses, start foundations, and in general, work to make the world around us a better place. Grief is universal. How we decide to move onward, seeking healing, is individual. A significant part of my healing comes through the courageous kindness actions of others. As you listen to my podcasts, you will hear how you can give and receive courageous kindness too. Together, we are better.
Welcome to Real Grief, Real Healing with Mindy Corporan, taking a deep dive into the reality of the difficulty grief brings and offering insight into the healing available to each of us. Today, Episode 3, The Power of Listening. And now your host, Mindy Corporan.
Hi, friends. It's Mindy Corporan on Real Grief, Real Healing. Thank you for joining me again. If you are joining me for a second or possibly third time, today I want to re-engage us at the emergency room on April 13th, 2014. In episode 1, I explained a little bit about April 12th, a lot about April 13th. If you haven't listened to that episode and you're starting this one, you might want to go back so that you can get some details. I left everyone in the emergency room shortly after our family discovered that not only had my father been murdered, but my son had also been murdered by a white supremacist. While we were in the ER, that was not actually the topic of interest. Certainly the topic of interest was that we had just lost, by a violent crime, 2 extremely important family members. My 14-year-old son, Reed Underwood, and my father, William Corporan. At the time we were at the ER, I knew from possibly chatter going on around me that another person had been murdered, but I didn't know the person's gender, nor did I understand where they had been murdered. I thought maybe they had been murdered at the Jewish community campus as well. While we were in the emergency room, it was still very chaotic. And we were waiting, and we seemed to wait for quite a while to release the names of my dad and son, because my older brother, Will, was driving into Kansas City from his home in Arkansas. While we were in the emergency room in Overland Park, Kansas, people kept showing up. And they weren't just random people, they were important people. It's interesting how, and very helpful, how the important people in your life show up when they need to. I know that frequently I'll feel that I might need to show up for a friend, and I might or might not realize why or know why, but I might call that friend, I might send a card, I might just send a text. And then I'll hear back from that friend that that was the right time. And certainly this was a monumental occasion. We had just had 2 people murdered in our family, which is not common, certainly not common in Overland Park, Kansas. And so important people started to show up. My cousin, my dad's cousin, Kirby, showed up. People from my office. my business partner, Richard, 2 women from the office who I worked with, Laura and Cindy, a friend of the family, Jay, and numerous people kept showing up. I could tell by the looks on their faces that what was going on was real. And I'll probably repeat that statement because it just didn't feel real at the time. We were in the emergency room. It seemed like much longer than maybe we should have been or needed to be. And there's no blame being placed on anyone. We were waiting to release the names of Reet and my dad for family purposes. While we were there, it gave us the opportunity to talk to nurses about organ donation. It's very important to me that I pause and let you know that the injuries that Reet suffered did not allow him to be a full organ donor. However, he was able to be a donor of tissue and ligaments. If there can be any light shined on that day in particular, April 13th, it happened in a smaller room with my husband by my side and a nurse sitting in front of me with her hands on my knees, tears streaming down my face when she said, "He can be a donor." And they told me that I would fill out the material the next day and to be waiting for a phone call so that I could give approval. That was a light, and it has continued to be a light. We left the emergency room, and Lynn drove me and my mom to my mom and dad's home. Everyone had departed, and her house was empty. 6 years later, I call it her house, but when I walked into her house, it was their home. I remember the kitchen counter had mail strewn all over it. The smell of their home was the same smell I'd had in my brain and senses for years. It was just our family home. It isn't where I grew up, but it's where my mom and dad lived. His chair sat empty, and I made a beeline for it. I curled up in a ball in his green chair, and I'm smiling a bit and almost chuckling. My mom didn't like that chair. He'd been on a hunt for the chair for him, a chair that fit the length of his legs, a chair that fit his back, a chair that he really liked. Oh, it was funny. It didn't necessarily go with her decor. But as you know, in marriages and relationships, she let him have the chair. I curled up in my dad's chair, and I tried to make myself as small as I could. I wanted to disappear. It was quiet in the house. My mom was somewhere. Lynn was on a phone, I think maybe in the hallway. And I didn't move from that chair for a long time, long enough that the house started to fill with people. Again, important people in our lives. I remember being very curious about how they found us. How did they know my mom's address? How did they know that's where we would be? It was comforting to have so many people arrive, but it was also more sad and made the whole day very real. I made a few phone calls. I took a few phone calls and explained to people who talked to me on the phone what I knew, which wasn't very much, just that my dad and son had been murdered, and that I had heard someone else was murdered too, and that I didn't understand why. It was the looks on their faces the looks on the faces of the people who showed up at the house. It made it seem more real. The somberness was palatable. There were tears in everyone's eyes. I realized I needed to get out of my dad's chair and start talking to people or hugging people and thanking them for coming. And people kept coming. And then a person walked in the house who was so important at the time. My heart leaped, and it was Adam Hamilton. It was our pastor from Church of the Resurrection. I was a member. Lynn and Lucas and Reet were members, and my mom and dad had just become members. We'd been attending there probably since Reet had been about 3 and Lucas was born. I had met Pastor Hamilton probably 2 years before in a funny spot. We were in the grocery store in the dressing aisle, and I think I was looking for ranch dressing, and I don't know what he was looking for, but we passed each other, and I glanced at him, and he glanced at me. And I said, "Yes, I'm a member of your church." And he apologized for not knowing who I was, which was fine. It's kind of a big church. So here he is. He walks into the house, and the last time I saw him was in the dressing aisle at the grocery store. And I'm sobbing, not completely out of control, but almost. And I had to tell him the words I'd heard. I wanted instruction from him. I felt like he was a direct link to God for me because I had heard the words, "Your Father's in heaven, go find Reet." He took me by the hands. We were in the middle of my mom and dad's living room, and there were people, it seems, all around us. And he said, "I'm so sorry." And I said, "I need to talk to you." And he said, "Okay," kind of startled. And I said, "Let's go find a private place." So we went to my parents' office upstairs. And I cried through the entire conversation, which was probably pretty short. I was able to relay to him exactly what had happened, exactly how I had pulled into the parking lot, what I had seen, and then, most importantly, what I had heard. I said, "Pastor Hamilton, I heard the words, 'Your Father's in heaven, go find Reet.'" And then at the emergency room, I found him, and he was also dead. So I'm confused. Where's God? Why did I hear those words? Why us? Why them? And with so much compassion, he prayed. He prayed for me. He prayed with me. He said he didn't understand either, and that he knows that there's evil in the world. But then he said something that I've held so close to my heart. And I have to stop here and say, I didn't like his answer. I didn't like his answer one bit. What I wanted was for it to be fixed. I wanted it to not be real. I wanted him to say, "They're really alive. That wasn't your father. Your son's okay." That's what I wanted, and I needed it desperately. But what he said was, "You have a very broken heart, and you are going to have transcendence. You are hearing things and feeling things that no one else is going to understand. But I believe that God is with you. I believe that God was with you in that parking lot. And I believe that God will continue to be with you. Mindy, you need to keep listening. Keep listening." I'm sure we had a few more things to say, and he probably prayed for me again through tears of his own. And then we walked down the stairs. I wasn't all the way down the stairs yet when I heard someone say, "There's going to be a student vigil at 8:30. And my heart almost leapt out of my chest. And I said to someone, "I need to be there." And the house was even more full, but all of a sudden it got quiet. And the few people around me looked at me with their eyes wide in disbelief and basically said, "You don't need to be anywhere. What are you thinking?" There were women gathered around my mom at the dining room table, holding her hand. Their arms were on her shoulders. My husband was there, Len, and I remember looking up at him with my hands in his hands, and I said, "I need to be at this student vigil." And I have to tell you, I don't know what he said back to me, and I don't know that he knows what he said back to me, but we're both pretty sure he said, "No, I don't think you should go." And I just said, "I have to. I'm listening. I have to go." So a couple gathered around me. There are a couple in particular that have a son named Dawson. And Dawson and Reet met in first grade. And Dawson and Reet were in Cub Scouts together. And then they crossed over to Boy Scouts together. And in my family, it was almost in our marriage contract, if you will, Lynn would not do the camping. Lynn doesn't like bugs or sleeping outside. And not that I like bugs, but I love sleeping outside and I love camping. So in our marriage arrangement, it was decided from the beginning that if any camping were to be done, with or without our children, I would be the parent that would be doing the camping. And Josh, Dawson's dad, was the camper in their family. And we went on every camp out together with our boys. It was wonderful. I have such fond memories of the raccoons getting in the tent and trying to get a decent shower before climbing into a bed at night. And I also remember tornado sirens and a lot of rain often. I still love camping. And this is the couple. It's Josh and Jerry. And somehow they're standing right next to me. And I said, "I need to go to this vigil." And I don't know if it was them or someone else who said, "Well, it's gotten chilly outside and you might want to put on a jacket." And I also had on flip-flops. So I took myself to my mom's closet by myself and I just grabbed a big sweatshirt. It happened to be an Oklahoma sweatshirt from the University of Oklahoma. And it happened to be my dad's, who is a double XL. And I'm an extra small. And I put that sweatshirt on, not even thinking about it. And I put on my mom's tennis shoes. And out I walked into the living room, still with people saying, "We don't think you should go." And Josh and Jerry took me by the hand, and out the door we walked. And while I was in their car, driving to this Episcopal church, I went over the day probably 8 times out loud with them. I kept repeating from the moment I woke Reed up to the moment that a doctor told us that he didn't survive, everything that I could remember. And I kept wondering, how could I have changed it? What could I have done differently? Was this my fault? Why wasn't I with Reed in the ambulance? Why did this happen? Why them? Why us? And why is the vigil at an Episcopal church? All of these things kept staying in my mind, swirling, and they kept listening. Important people in my life showed up, And it started at the emergency room, and it was already continuing as I walked into the vigil with Josh and Jerry. But before we walked into the Episcopal Church, I said to them, I know why it's here. And I looked at them with my eyes very wide, and I was not understanding what was beginning to happen in my life. I said to them, the Episcopal Church is holding this vigil because only God knows that Reet Griffin Underwood was baptized in an Episcopal church. And they just looked at me, a little stunned, probably stunned by what I said and probably stunned by what I was believing at the time. I didn't know why I needed to be at the vigil, except that I was told it was a student vigil. And when I was 16 years old, a very good friend of mine was killed in a car accident. Kyle Lovelace lost his life. And the 16-year-old Mindy was hurting so badly on April 13th, 2014, not only for myself and my family, but I was hurting for all of the students and friends of Reet that were yet to be teenagers or teenagers. They needed to know that I had already survived a horrible experience by losing my friend Kyle. I wanted them to know that their life could go on. So now I'm at the vigil, and somehow Josh and Jerry hand me off to my very good friends, Tara and Laura. And Tara and Laura walk me into the vigil, and we find seats up in the front left-hand side of their sanctuary. And we sat quietly, and I was just in awe of how many people showed up. And I couldn't understand how they knew or why they knew. I still did not comprehend the enormity of what had happened. I listened to people speak, and I know that they meant well. I know that they were trying to help the grieving people in the audience. I know they were probably trying to help me, and they didn't even know it. They didn't know I was in the audience. It wasn't scratching the surface on my emotions, and it wasn't that they were doing a poor job. It's just that no one knew the depth of where my heart and soul had just been taken. I turned to Tara and I said, I'm supposed to speak. And of course, she looked at me a little incredulous and said, what are you going to say? And I said, I don't know, but I'm supposed to say something. And as a good friend would, she got up and asked the senior pastor, Gardemo, who I know now, she asked him, could I speak? And he came and sat in front of me with wonder in his eyes about who I was and why I was there. And when I explained who I was, he said, yes, you can speak after the last person. And he introduced me. And my intention had been to really let the students in the room know that this was horrible and that we were living life, we were loving life, and somehow we would live life again. I didn't know when I said those words how completely difficult it would be for our family. But I did know that 16-year-old Mindy was sad all over again, and I wanted any teenager in that room to know they could get through this. I wanted them to celebrate Reet's life, and I wanted them to be able to move on and find their onward. I didn't really say all those words, and I didn't say it very eloquently when I go back and listen. But I let people know that I had faith. I let people know that I had no doubt that they were in heaven. In fact, I'd already been told that they were in heaven. I'd been told that Dad was in heaven. And that's how I spoke at a vigil the night that my dad and son were murdered. So many times we find strength within ourselves that we have no idea is there. We've heard about people lifting cars off of babies or moving a boulder to get someone's ankle out of harm's way. And maybe that's the courage that I found, or the bravery that I found, or the strength. You can call it whatever you want. I know I was led there. I know I was supposed to be there because hate looked like it had won that day. And maybe for the 2 minutes it took to take the lives that were taken, hate won. But that was the only time. It was the wrong family, the wrong town, the wrong community. We've risen above that. And my message is that all of us can. Kindness and love and hope and peace can be louder. Thank you again for joining me. I hope we get to continue this journey together. Friends, thanks so much for joining me today for this podcast of Real Grief, Real Healing with Mindy Corporon. If you want to dive deeper into how you might heal yourself or a friend, please pick up a copy of my book, Healing a Shattered Soul. Published on May 3rd, 2021, you can find my memoir anywhere books are sold. You will also find me in social media channels as Mindy Corporon. Take time to help yourself heal, accepting courageous kindness. Take time to heal another by giving courageous kindness. Together, we are better.
Real Grief, Real Healing is copyright 2021 to 2022, Mindy Corporon, all rights reserved. Our theme music is composed by Dave Croft and used with permission. This podcast is a production of 818 Studios.